like the title of the video says, we are going to be covering ranged weapons for Evil Dead the game and making a tier list. So the first two things that I'd like to cover are overkill damage and my methodology. As for overkill damage, keep in mind that many of the weapons in the game are designed in such a way that it is easy to farm overkill damage for the scoreboard at the end of the game. The scoreboard at the end of the game does include all overkill damage, so if you shoot a unit that has 200 HP in the head for 2000 damage, it will account for all of that. So just keep in mind when you look at your damage at the end game, it's not completely practical damage, and a lot of these weapons kind of bleed into that a lot more than others. So in the end, overkill damage can be useful for possessed units and bosses and things like that, but a lot of the time, some of these weapons that you might think are better don't really contribute all that much, and I'll explain sort of how that works and the difference between per shot damage / per pellet damage and DPS and some things like that when we get into the specific weapons. The second thing I want to talk about is my methodology. My methodology is that I have played the game quite a bit, so I have some practical knowledge, both dealing with laggy lobbies, pretty decent lobbies, dealing with every weapon of every rarity. So yeah, I'm not coming from this of a perspective of I've never used this weapon, I've never picked it up. I've used all these weapons, I've used them a bit. Some of them I've used less, admittedly, just because, you know, it's the Sawgun kind of thing. But I'm also approaching this from the perspective of statistics. I have all of these statistics here. They speak for themselves in a lot of cases. Now, I'm not just basing this on a spreadsheet. I'm not just basing this on theoretical knowledge. At the end of the day, practical usage is just as important. So let's go ahead and jump into it now. So first off, we have the Blunderbuss. I'm just going to throw it on the chart. So the Blunderbuss is one of those weapons that I see a lot of people like. Now, it is one of those weapons that I kind of mentioned that's good for farming overkill damage. It is a single shot, single pellet weapon. This is important because shotguns and lower damage per bullet guns don't tend to farm overkill as well as weapons like this, where you do a lot of damage in a single pellet. So what does that mean? That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad gun. What are its strengths? The Blunderbuss actually has a fair bit of strength. It has very high damage per shot. It is very ammo efficient. It is hit scan, which not all the weapons in the game are hit scan, but the vast majority are, so that doesn't really super bump it up in the tier list or anything. But being hit scan definitely is better than being projectile based. And then the final, probably most important thing about the mechanics of the Blunderbuss is that it has a very, very large reticle. This thing is a lot easier to aim with than most of the other weapons in the game. It is very easy to get headshots with. Now that being said, let's go ahead and look at its statistics. I've color-coded a lot of this so it's a little bit easier to visualize. So if we're looking at the Blunderbuss, we can see that its damage per shot isn't the most insane thing. But at the end of the day, that's kind of difficult to compare because we have stuff like the Boomstick. All of the shotguns do like crazy damage at higher rarities, but this is very respectable damage. Now, its scaling isn't very good. It goes from 235 to 285. If you look at the scaling on like the Boomstick, any of the shotguns really, they have huge scaling. And I'm not saying that the shotguns shouldn't be toned down, but this is a tier list based on how the game works now kind of thing. So moving on, we see that the rate of fire goes up. This only really matters for Amanda during her Q, where she can ignore reload speed. Now, that being said, the fire rate is very, very slow. That means while some people might think the Blunderbuss is actually really, really good in Amanda's hands because of her Q, it still fires very, very slowly. So even for Amanda, this isn't the best weapon. We see that its reload speed actually does scale a little bit, and it gets the fastest reload speed in the game, I believe. Let me double check. Yep, it's the fastest. So this thing actually reloads pretty quickly. Some of the other weapons aren't quite as nice in this regard, But at the end of the day, this next stat is what really matters, and that is that you have one shot in every magazine. This means you're going to have very low DPS. Every time you shoot, you're going to have to reload. Now, this transfers into about a 40% uptime on shooting, so that means you're going to be reloading a lot of the time. The magazine DPS and the theoretical DPS, don't worry about those too much. Just know that finger to the wind, this thing's DPS is kind of low. That being said, a lot of these numbers appear low because they're being compared against just kind of Chad weapons like the Boomstick and stuff like that. So this number right here, this weapon right here, just outclasses everything. If we were to delete that, you'd see some numbers jump around. And if we delete all the shotguns, you'd see some of the other weapons kind of jump up a little bit. Let's go ahead and undo that though. So that being said, the Blunderbuss has a lot of mechanical advantages just because it's very easy to use, but its damage per second is very low. Now, what would I recommend the Blunderbuss for? For one, I actually think the Blunderbuss is an okay weapon for supports that don't need a specific weapon type. I'm thinking of support Ash with like a pistol or something. But the Blunderbuss is actually, because it does so much damage per pellet per shot, it's actually pretty easy to get to the point where you one-tap basic unpossessed units to the head. This is really good for ammo conservation, but not only for ammo conservation, just for speed. You can kill things more quickly just by tapping, shooting the one thing in the head, and then getting back to your F spam somewhere. So I think the Blunderbuss is actually kind of okay for supports like Cheryl and Pablo, not as much for support Ash. On certain other characters, like especially Hunter, I think because of the reload speed buff you get, it doesn't feel as bad, but it's just not going to perform like the other weapons. It just never will. Its DPS is just always going to be lower. So, where do I rank the Blunderbuss? I rank it right here at a C. I think it's fairly solid as a C. It's kind of slightly less than average in my opinion, but at the same time, it is very easy to use, and you can farm overkill if you really care about the scoreboard at the end. So moving on to the Boomstick, let's talk about the Boomstick. The Boomstick is just kind of like the Giga Chad kind of weapon. It does absolutely crazy base damage when you get upgraded versions of it. It has an extremely fast fire rate. This makes it insane on Amanda. It's one of the very few builds that I actually run Last Chance on. Last Chance, even after the nerf, is not, even before the nerf, it wasn't very good. But on Amanda, where you can take one shot, press your Q, and then you get Last Chance for like 7 seconds on every shot, it actually ends up being a pretty decent value, specifically on her, and specifically with like the Boomstick and Double Barrel. Its reload speed isn't incredibly fast, which can be kind of rough when you're dealing with hordes of enemies. Now, that being said, the Boomstick is one of those weapons that once you get a higher rarity, you can literally solo kill a boss in one magazine very easily. If you basically walk up, point blank them in the head, Evil Ash will just die. Henrietta will just die. Elagos is a little bit tougher because they float around and everything, but if they're focusing you during a combo, you can dodge, shoot them in the head very, very easily even then. So the Boomstick is a deletion tool. It is not very good for clearing out ads. Now, generally speaking, I don't think you should be clearing out ads as a hunter. I think that's just a way for you to farm scoreboard points. So I don't value that super highly. I more value your ability to delete possessed units and bosses and conserve your ammo the rest of the time. So where do I put this thing? Its stats kind of speak for itself. It just does so much damage. I'm going to put this into A tier. I think it really is, just for the purpose of the hunter deleting those high threat targets, it's just super good. It does so much damage per ammo used that it's very, very efficient. Now, I don't think it's spam. I don't think it's super practical in all situations, but I think it's really, really powerful. So moving on, we have the Crossbow. Now, we're jumping from one of the best to one of the worst. Now, the Crossbow, a lot of people like it, and I think a lot of people like it because they can farm that overkill damage. On Ed Getley, it gets even higher overkill damage. Let's talk about its weaknesses. For one, it kind of has all the weaknesses of the Blunderbuss. It has slightly higher damage. If you look at the stats over there, it reloads a little bit slower than the Blunderbuss at all rarities. Its rate of fire is slower, a little bit more damage, so that's something. But generally speaking, that doesn't really help you hit too many breakpoints, which is a practical way to view DPS. Also, it has one in the magazine. So what does that mean? What does that end up meaning? It ends up meaning that because of all of these factors combined, it ends up probably doing less DPS than the Blunderbuss at pretty much every rarity. But not only that, it is not a hit scan weapon, it is projectile based, which means you are incredibly subject to lag. If you're moving around, the actual projectile can come from where you were. Sometimes I see this thing have really wonky hitboxes and hit things randomly where I wasn't even aiming. This thing is very hard to use. So in my opinion, as the hunter, you need to have a reliable weapon. You need to be able to instantly delete what you need to. And if you're working with the crossbow, you're basically gimping yourself right off the bat. So I'm going to place the crossbow into D tier. It isn't very good in my opinion. The damage potential isn't bad, but if you're just looking at the scoreboard, maybe you can get away with the crossbow, but in most practical applications, it just doesn't cut it for me. Let's talk about the double barrel. So the double barrel is basically the same thing as the boomstick, but just slightly worse. Now, if you look over here, it has less damage than the boomstick, and then all the other stats are pretty much identical. All of these other stats, and I don't have it listed for like dismemberment and everything. I've hidden most of the stuff that isn't super practical for ranged weapons, at least in evaluating them. But So basically the double barrel is just a worse version of the boomstick. Now I've tried testing for spread and things like that, but at the end of the day, the double barrel is essentially just a worse boomstick. Now I could say this could be a B, but in all practical scenarios, this thing basically performs exactly like the boomstick. If you have this in a hunter ash hands, it's actually slightly better than the boomstick. So that being said, let's move on. Double barrel is basically just a rehash of the boomstick. Let's talk about the hunting rifle now. So the hunting rifle is a very interesting weapon. At white rarity, it's not great at all. It's very bad. And by the way, this list is accounting for all rarities, kind of on average. So the white version is not great. The blue one is currently bugged. Most of you guys know this, that it does 5 times as much balance bar as it should. This obviously makes it very good. I don't personally like to use it because I consider it an exploit, but it does make it a whole lot better. Now you'll notice this thing does scale kind of like the Blunderbuss. It basically is the same damage component. However, it does get a magazine increase. So right here at Epic and Legendary, you have 3 rounds in your magazine. This actually really helps your uptime. It really helps your DPS. You'll see a jump here in DPS. So I think the hunting rifle is probably one of the more balanced weapons in the game. Headshots are highly rewarded. It scales with its magazine, so it's not quite as punishing into late game when you're trying to shoot multiple things, or when units just have too much health and you have to shoot them multiple times, or bosses and things of that nature. So I think the hunting rifle is very well balanced. I actually like the hunting rifle after having used it quite a bit, though it just doesn't quite perform like some of the stars, but it vastly outperforms a lot of these underneath it. Next up, we have the lever action. Now, the lever action is kind of a weird weapon as well. This thing is basically a worse revolver that uses long gun ammo. And if you know anything about ammo, it's that handgun ammo is more ubiquitous. You get more handgun ammo than you get long gun ammo. So not only is this thing using a worse ammo type than the revolver, it does less damage per shot. Now that being said, it does fire very, very quickly. You can see right here its rate of fire is half a second per shot. This is very, very fast, even compared to like the revolver, who's like around a second. So this thing can shoot faster than the revolver. However, the damage per shot can lead to some ammo problems, especially on long gun, and there's a lot better long gun alternatives already in the list. So personally, I think that the lever action rifle is okay, but it really suffers ammo consumption problems. So I would probably place it right here above the lever action rifle in terms of like being a hunter. For other characters besides the hunter, I actually kind of place it a little bit below the blunderbuss. This thing just doesn't have the ammo efficiency. The blunderbuss is going to let you one tap things and be ammo efficient, and that can be really important on other characters where you're trying to conserve your ammo to give to the hunter. Also, the blunderbuss uses special ammo type, which isn't as contested as long rifle. So if you have somebody using a double barrel of boomstick, something better, and then you're using all your bullets with a lever action, well, that's just a waste by default. Not even considering they're a hunter or something. That's just wasted ammo. Moving on, we're going to talk about the pistol, which is basically the exact same thing as the lever action, but in pistol form. And I don't mean statistically wise, I mean practicality wise. This thing is just the ammo hog of handguns. It does very, very low base damage. You can see its base damage is 55. Now, the one redeeming factor of the pistol is the fact that it scales very hard. So whereas the blunderbuss goes from 235 to 285, this is a 50 damage increase. The pistol also gets a 50 damage increase. However, that almost doubles its DPS. It almost doubles its damage. Now, the blunderbuss, obviously that's not a 50% increase. On the pistol, rarity really matters. This means that common pistols are literal garbage, and any of the rarities are a super big upgrade. Now, the other kind of redeeming factor is the fact that it has a huge fire rate. Its fire rate can be 5 times per second. Now, that being said, this thing is not going to be a very efficient usage of your ammo. Now, for support Ash, it can be really good for marking targets, but other than that, this thing just does not perform. Now, it does get a very decent magazine bonus, which does help its uptime, but at the end of the day, the pistol just is not going to be extremely efficient, and that's going to put it behind the lever action as well. The lever action is just a little bit more ammo efficient than the pistol is most of the time. There's very little you're going to one-shot with a pistol unless you're on like a super stacked hunter, and if you're running a pistol on a hunter, well, don't. There's so many other better options. So moving on, we have the revolver. Now this thing is kind of like the Chad of handguns. This thing is super, super good. It's very ammo efficient. It fires, it feels good to fire. It fires about once per second. Its reload speed isn't terrible. But it's not bad for how much ammo you get. You get 6 shots in your mag. I guess this would be more of a clip than a mag, but you get 6 shots, and then the reload speed is also still pretty decent. It's ammo efficient at 150 damage per shot. It's not too bad. It's not quite as bad as some of these other ones, and it does use handgun, which makes it even more forgiving. In a hunter's hand, this thing is just an absolute beast. It's a really, really good gun, and its uptime is very large. And this is where we're first going to talk about damage per magazine a little bit. This thing can shoot a lot of common, so if you actually do need to clear possessed basics, you can do that with quite, like, 3-4 shots. If you need to clear a bunch of unpossessed basics, you can clear six of them, right? You can literally just go bam, 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 bam. Whereas a lot of the other weapons, you can't quite get that efficiency on. Hunting rifle, you don't have enough rounds in your magazine. Same with the boomstick. Same with the blunderbuss, things like that. So I'm actually going to put revolver at the top of A tier. It's close to S tier. It doesn't quite have the base damage that I'd like to see. It doesn't, if you look at its damage, it doesn't scale extremely well. It's got that 50 damage scaling that most of the other weapons have. So even if you get a legendary, it's not super different than even having a rare. So just keep that in mind. This thing doesn't scale like insanely well, but even just at its core, it's a very practical, very usable weapon. Next up, we have the Sawgun. Now, I'm going to just do this, and then we're going to talk about it. So the Sawgun has a lot of problems. For one, it's like the Crossbow, where it is not hit scan, it is a projectile-based weapon. But not only that, its base damage is much lower than the Crossbow's. To make up for this, you can rapidly fire the Sawgun. It has a very decent fire rate. You can see here. Its reload speed's not terrible, and its magazine is very large. This might lead you to think that it's really good or something. At the end of the day, this thing is just so wonky to shoot. It's very hard to land projectiles on. It doesn't do that much damage. It's not very ammo efficient. it just feels bad. Most people don't pick up special ammo because most people don't run special ammo, so it's going to be harder to get ammo unless your team is specifically coordinated with you. And the only redeeming factor about the Sawgun is that it has very high dismemberment damage. You can see it on the white. I think it's 200. Very high dismemberment damage. The problem with that I have is because it's projectile based, it's actually hard to land those projectiles. So the Sawgun just very firmly sits at an F for me. And then finally we're going to talk about the shotgun, and I'm just going to place it up here. This is the best weapon in the game in my opinion. This thing scales very well with damage, not as well as like the Boomstick or something. However, the shots that you have in the magazine are massive with this weapon. It's kind of like the Revolver in that it can clear hordes if it needs to, but it also has that super high base damage. So if you're shooting something like, you know, a boss or a possessed, that you're not going to have to use as many shots. Now, the one caveat that I will say to this, and this is true of all shotguns, is that they don't have the range of other weapons. But from a practicality standpoint, even though you have spread on the pellets, most of your damage is going to be done from very up close on objectives. You're going to be getting rushed by possessed units or bosses or whatever, or you're just going to walk over while they're in a grab animation and just shoot them point blank in the head. This is 90% of the time how you're going to be fighting. So that pellet spread really doesn't matter, especially if you take the perk for it, which a lot of people travel through at least one point in that perk trying to get Wig Splitter, which is the headshot damage. So that's my opinions on the weapon tier list. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, if I missed anything or misrepresented anything, let me know in the comment section below, and thanks for watching.